Let us start with the secure synopsis of 29th of May 2021 and let us get started with the general studies. 1. The root cause of poverty in India is that structure of society is shaped to create poverty. Critically analyze. So, is poverty something that is inherent in the society, or if the structure of the society is designed in such a way that there are people who will work for somebody else and there are people who will make somebody else work? So, if somebody takes a birth in a rich family, they tend to be owners of a certain business, and if somebody takes a birth in a poor family, they tend to be the worker of that business. So is the society itself structured in that way is the question. Now let's have a look at the answer. There are some data given here, and then let's go to the structure of the society and how it reinforces poverty and the way forward for it. So in India, about 21.9% of the population lives below the poverty line as per 2011 census. Now the causes of poverty is actually attributed to population growth, agriculture, society, lack of education, and among others. Because population growth means more number of people, less number of resources to access it. Agriculture society means it is dependent on seasonal rains, and only when the rains come, they can make some money out of producing food. Lack of education leads to lack of accessibility. For example, if somebody doesn't know how to read and write, how will they actually approach a vaccination center for a vaccine, right? So all these things create a lot of poverty. Poverty is a multi-dimensional issue, and it is not just about staying hungry or not having enough money. It is multidimensional. However, according to sociologists, the structure of the society is such that some are made to do jobs that forces them to be in poverty. As Aristotle said, from the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjection and others for rule. Like the birth has decided a lot of people's fortune. This seems to be the case in India too, where jobs of manual scavenging still exists to reinforce poverty among the people. And let's have a look at the structure of the society that reinforces poverty from a functionalist point of view. Functionalist means it considers the example of human body, that there are certain parts of the body, and those certain parts of the body has to do that specific work. For example, heart cannot start seeing tomorrow, and your eyes cannot start acting like a liver tomorrow. So everybody has a certain amount of specific task to be done, and they have to be done accordingly. So, from a functionalist theory, it assumes that the society's structures and processes exist because they serve important functions for society's stability and continuity. In line with this view, functionalist theories in sociology assume that stratification exists because it also serves important functions for society. This theory leads to several assumptions, such as some jobs are more important than other jobs. For example, the job of a brain surgeon is more important than a job of a shoe shining person on the roadside, because these jobs require more amount of skills and knowledge. So it takes more amount of skills and knowledge, and that is why a person with knowledge of brain surgery has given more amount of pay, and because of the skills that he has. And when you give a lot of pay to them, more rewards to these people, it tends to create a lot of division among the society. For example, let's say an hospital has a budget of 100 rupees. Out of that 100 rupees, if you are giving away 50 rupees to the doctors who are extremely well talented, well skilled, and well knowledgeable, and the remaining 50 is utilized for creating infrastructure within the hospital, like buying telephones, or investing in cleaning things and investing in beds and all that, and the remaining 5 rupees is given out as salaries for the people who are involved in cleaning and security guards and other nurses kind of thing. So this creates a lot of imbalance in terms of the payment that people receive within a hospital, within one single roof. So some people are, some people do not have the opportunity to grow because the salary itself is so low, and some people are given more amount of money, and they can expand their resources even higher. So the functionalist view assumes that people move up the economic ladder based on their abilities, skills, knowledge, and more generally their merit. This applies that if they do not move up the ladder, they lack the necessary merit. Now, what is the way forward? The Global Multidimensional Poverty Index of 2018, released by the United Nations, noted that about 271 million people moved out of poverty between 2005 to 2006 and 2015 to 2016. So the poverty rate might have halved from 55% to 28%, but it is still a huge part considering our population. So rapid economic growth and use of technology for social sector programs has helped reduce some amount of poverty in India. There should be a realistic assessment in the current situation of poverty in India, and the direct income transfer to the needy is an immediate solution. As when the money comes into the people's pockets, they can actually spend it accordingly and create wealth for themselves and for the nation. Taxing wealth of rich people can be another chance. By improving social infrastructure and job opportunities in rural areas, migration can be stopped, and them living in slums and crumpled houses can be completely reduced. So investment in agriculture by the government is necessary to decrease rural poverty, not just subsidies, but also in terms of technologies, and also technologies in the farming sector, so that all weather agriculture can be practiced. Investment in infrastructure is the need of the hour, and China did it so, and it has been successful in reducing the number of people in poor category. And more initiatives such as Ayushman Bharat has to be brought in place to empower people. Now, let's conclude it. Despite rapid growth and development, we have witnessed a jobless growth. And there is a jobless growth, people do not have money to spend. You might be having huge amount of FDIs coming into India. If those FDIs do not create jobs, then it's going to be a little problem for India, because the number of taxes that you can collect is extremely less, and in turn, the social welfare expenditure also starts reducing. So, this is unacceptably high proportion of our population continues to suffer from severe and multidimensional deprivation. Thus, a more comprehensive and inclusive approach is required to eradicate poverty in India. This will be more important in a post-pandemic world. The next question is of general studies to critically analyze the role played by WHO in rendering global health security during the COVID 19 pandemic. Also, propose reforms to strengthen its role in the handling future pandemics. So, we had COVID 19 pandemic. The COVID 19 pandemic is still going on. But what was the role of WHO? How did it even handle this COVID 19? Let's have a look at it. First and foremost, it's a specialized agency of United Nations, and it was established on 7th April 1948. So it's a quite an old organization, and it's headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. It is also a member of the United Nations Development Group. It has been at the forefront of coordinating global response against COVID-19 pandemic, and also many other epidemics that we have witnessed in the recent past. Now, what's the criticism against WHO? First is lack of preparedness. Despite knowing enough about the SARS outbreak, from 2007, it knew that there is going to be a mutable nature of virus, coupled with China's rapid urbanization and close proximity to exotic animals, wet market, and also illegal wildlife trade. In 2015, the coronavirus family of disease was selected to be included in the list of priorities for urgent research and development. It was also earmarked as a primary contender for emerging diseases like lead to cause a major epidemic. This assessment was reiterated in WHO's 2018 annual review of prioritized diseases. Now, there was also a delay in declaration. WHO has been criticized for its unexplained delay in declaring COVID 19 as public health emergency of international concern. Many governments reached out to WHO for an advisory, but it did not give out clarity in terms of shutting down the economies, shutting down or putting down lockdowns or declaring health emergency. And the very committee that had to declare emergency was split on whether to declare it or not. So WHO did not take any decision stated that, and focus is not much on the numbers. And it started thinking about it only when it started increase in many other countries, and that increase happened in tenfold. So the pandemic, especially when the COVID-19 was exhibiting the characteristics of pandemic and spreading rapidly around the world, WHO delayed in declaration. Indecision in visiting China, despite knowing that China was the source of coronavirus, it delayed in visiting China to inquire about the source of the virus. And exclusion of Taiwan, not taking Taiwan's suggestion to its entirety, and always supporting China because it believes in one China policy. Delay in acknowledging human to human transmission of the virus. So, this is despite the fact that Taiwan had warned, it delayed. And the recent reports clearly highlight China stayed silent on its knowledge of human to human transmission, not endorsing the use of trade and travel restrictions. The explosion of travel restrictions that countries implemented to counter COVID 19 prompted arguments that these restrictions violated the human rights violation and violations that the WHO did not probe despite having authority to do so. right? So the US excessively banned travel from developing countries. So at the same time, it can be appreciated for developing coronavirus vaccines and being involved with the companies, and also sharing information and its attempts to counter online misinformation and disinformation. This has earned widespread praise for it. So, what are the measures to empower WHO? First and foremost is mobilize more resources. Do not be dependent on single source of money. It is the biennial budget is $4.42 billion, and most of this money that is given are dictated by those donors, and their priorities are also taken into consideration while ignoring the developing countries' prioritization, because most of the diseases start from the developing or underdeveloped countries. And if the decisions of the members who donate more is taken into consideration, I would doubt completely the efficacy of WHO. So it has to coordinate with other global players such as Gates Foundation and Doctors Without Borders, and help address the way it needs to be done. Helps focus on mission of WHO. The mission has to be reread again, and also respond to the situation rather than setting its own agenda. Increase the WHO's technical capacities and capabilities. Having been formed in 1948, it lacks certain amount of capacities and capabilities. It has to start its own new department on science, antimicrobial resistance, and digital health, and this will broaden the WHO's range of expertise. So the criticism being faced by the WHO has done great damage to its global reputation and standing. While the politicization of the WHO remains a serious concern, it also presents an opportunity to rethink the underpinnings of the broader global governance architecture. WHO reforms announced few months back should be implemented on a war footing. Its donor dependency has to be reduced, and this has weakened its capacity to address effectively. So, next question: efficiency and digitization cannot retreat the rights and dignities of marginalized individuals who are often the subjects of our criminal justice system. So, Supreme Court's E Committee, headed by Justice D.Y. Chandrachud, has tasked with integrating digital technologies to enhance productivity and efficiency in judiciary. It has published a draft document to articulate its vision to put in place an interoperable digital architecture that facilitates easy data sharing among all pillars of the criminal justice system, which includes police, prosecutors, prisons, and courts. So, what's the background? The ICJS, that is Interoperable Criminal Justice System, launched in 2019, is said to be fully operational and replace the existing need-based physical exchange of information. Which means, when need-based means whenever the information is asked, and it is asked through letters, and only then the information would be provided. But right now, if it is interoperable criminal justice system, most of the information will be available online for the legal practitioners to access it, and the hurdles in accessing this information will be completely reduced. It will also integrate existing centralized data systems such as crime and criminal tracking network systems and e-prisons and e-courts, promising seamless exchange of live data. But when there is a seamless exchange of live data, there will definitely be privacy concerns, and first and foremost, we need to enact data protection laws to protect these data. Now, issues of rights and dignity of marginalized due to digitization. Now the answer here is not that satisfactory, but it talks about habitual offenders and how some person who is a juvenile can also be put under a person who is a habitual offender, because under Juvenile Justice Act there is a principle of fresh start that is espoused, and which gives that person another chance to actually rectify himself. So that is something that we need to take care of, because once everything becomes digitized, we cannot differentiate between habitual offenders and the principle of fresh start amongst the Juvenile Justice Act. So even if we could take away the caste informed biases of data, a challenge insurmountable without annihilating the caste system. So this says that we'll have to first annihilate the caste system, even though it gives a caste informed it can take away the caste informed biases of data. Efficiency and digitization cannot recede the rights and dignities of marginalized individuals who are often the subjects of our criminal justice system. Deliberate upon the clash between the needs of humanity and principles of capitalism in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. We have seen how the vaccine distribution is happening, and vaccine prices have been set. Some companies are setting prices of 400 rupees or 600 rupees, and some companies are setting a price of 1,250 rupees. So it has become extremely difficult for hospitals, states, and the central government to actually procure. The central government should have made it centralized procurement by procuring it for 150 rupees that it is actually procuring for, and distributed it among the states. But now the states are calling global tenders. The hospitals are also procuring on its own, and this is leading to huge amount of price of these vaccines. So what's the clash between needs to humanity and the capitalistic principles? Some capitalists feel that the private producers of vaccines have this right to take money from the people as it is the compensation for investing in research and production. The purpose of governments is comes into picture here because it is they who have been elected by the people to improve the all-round well-being of all citizens, not merely to provide products to customers who can pay good prices for them, which is the means by which private enterprises meet their objective of producing profits for their investors. The COVID 19 crisis has revealed that inequities, inadequacy of capitalism to fulfill societal needs. If capitalist enterprises are not willing to fulfill public purposes, governments must create more public spirited enterprises to provide public goods equitably to all citizens. And we have seen how capitalists are trying to understand what the humanity needs by running artificial intelligence algorithms on social media, and they are trying to manipulate human minds in trying to buy certain products from their websites. And the investors have become the richest people on the planet right now, and also the new mRNA technologies can actually manipulate the composition of human bodies. So what measures that needs to be taken to balance profits and public welfare? There should be a means to regulate the prices and enhance production. Even USA, which is a strong capitalist nation itself, provided vaccines freely to its people, and India must ensure that those who cannot afford the vaccines must be inoculated. They are already burdened with loss of livelihood. It is imperative that lives are not valued less, and only a centralized procurement system can do this job. So, money driven capitalist values have drifted too far from the human values. Money has become the supreme measure of success in all spheres. The wealth of individuals, the size of companies, the scales of nations' economies, the sustainable health of complex systems, which human beings and societies is being lost of sight. And the COVID 19 crisis will not end capitalism. So, companies must rethink the purpose for their existence. It is imperative now that the more human and less money values are adopted. Democracy stands undermined in the direct proportion to every attack made on the citizens' right. Do you think IT rules 2021 have tilted towards the violation of these rights? Critically analyze. In 2019, Supreme Court came out used by the government to justify its new information technology rules, which compel encrypted social media messaging platforms to disclose their uh, user's identity. Also caution the center from doing anything which amounts to invasion of individual privacy. Recently, WhatsApp has sued government in Delhi High Court for infringing upon Article 21 by the government. So, background requirements in the intermediary guidelines pertaining to the first originator of information are example of such a reasonable restriction as per the central government, right? So, intermediary guidelines are a reasonable restriction on the central government because it cannot initiate any proceedings against the intermediaries. IT Minister Ravi Shankar Prasad has said that while the government was committed to ensuring right to privacy for all citizens, it is also responsible for maintaining law and order and ensuring national security, and that is why we need the originator of a particular message. The government pointed out that WhatsApp itself was seeking to mandate a privacy policy wherein it should share the data of its users with its parent company, Facebook, for marketing and advertising purposes. This was even when users are unwilling to share such data. The center stressed that the originator of information would only be traced in a scenario where other remedies had proven to be ineffective, making it as a last resort. The center is saying that we will be taking the information only when we have failed all other remedies to access the data. And center is also accusing WhatsApp that how did you send the data from your WhatsApp to the parent company Facebook for marketing advertising purposes. So both of them have trying to utilize the sentiment of the people and play against our right to privacy, and such an order would have to come from a competent court only. So what are the new IT rules and how are the violations of rights? So if you see, Section 79 only allows the central government to prescribe the due diligence that the intermediaries must observe to maintain their immunity. And the Supreme Court had laid down this mandate in its privacy judgment in the Puttaswamy case and also reiterated in Anuradha Basin case for internet freedom. So citizens will not be able to speak freely for fear that their private communications would be traced and used against them. And this means legal users and their messages would be under watch. So it is high time that the government and the social media intermediaries come to a conclusion, a complementary conclusion, wherein the rights of the citizens are not taken away. The Puttaswamy judgment was a landmark ruling passed by the Supreme Court in 2017, which said a person's right to privacy must be preserved, except in cases where legality, necessity, and proportionality are all weighed against it. This must be strictly adhered to, and a middle ground must be found between government and social media giants to balance national interest and privacy. The contest between Ayush and modern medicine shouldn't forget public health. Critically analyze the statement with suitable examples. So, on November 2020, the Central Council of Indian Medicine, a statutory body of the Ministry of Ayush, issued an amendment to the Indian Medicine Central Council, allowing about 58 surgical procedures to be performed by the postgraduate students of Ayurvedic education who have been graduated from Shalya and Shalakya. And they have to be formally trained in which they can practice independently afterwards. But IMA did not agree to it. They found it uncivil and foul, and they called it illegitimate mixopathy. So the body, which is India's largest medical association, said the newly constituted National Medical Commission has the responsibility and nobody else. The ministry subsequently published a clarification that postgraduate scholars can perform only the basic surgical procedures listed in the amendment, and that is rate is restrictive, not a policy shift. But IMA has rejected even this clarification. Now, issues with Ayush practitioners performing allopathic procedures. Right now, about 81% positions lying vacant at government community healthcare centers. Right, the shortage of trained government doctors in rural areas is a constant challenge in India, and this has also added a great amount of need of the Ayush practitioners. And where only about 35% of India's population lives, right, in urban areas. Only 35% of India's population lives, and most of them like to work in urban areas, leaving a huge amount of gap in rural areas. So the problem of 65% of India's residents not being able to access the trained doctor would still exist, even if the Ayurveda practitioners are, in consensus with the IMA doctors, because they all would like to, work in urban areas. The problem can be solved only if the adequate infrastructure, better working conditions, and incentives are in place. Until such time, unregistered medical practitioners will rule the rural populations and their preferred point of contact. Right, the major source of confusion that the new amendment could drive pertains to law and regulation. Only a few states in India allow Ayurveda practitioners to practice allopathy as well: Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, Punjab, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Assam, and Uttarakhand. And at present, no one can perform surgeries without allopathic drugs and diagnostics. So, what is the way forward? It is important to provide career growth, but public welfare must come first. Both systems must reach a point where they can complement each other. The Ministry of Ayush has government's support but lacks credibility, while the IMA has been responding aggressively. Meanwhile, on the ground, most healthcare workers are dissatisfied with one or the other part of their jobs. It is the addressing of these issues that can only stop the divide among the rural preferring doctors and urban preferring doctors. The current proposal to equip Ayush doctors with techniques in allopathic medicine is a death knell for its own benefit, because the indigenous medical systems cannot start relying on allopathic medicine now, in spite of laudable intent to revive and bring to mainstream Ayush systems. These different systems must complement each other and need not be arms with each other. General Studies for Good Governance is the technology, Citizens Charter is the tool. Elucidate the Indian experience of Citizens Charter in the context of above statement. In any nation, there is a need for good governance for sustainable development, both economic and social. The three major aspects highlighted in good governance are transparency, accountability, and responsiveness of the administration. Citizens Charter's initiative is a response to the mission for solving the problems which a citizen meets day in and day out while dealing with organizations providing public services. Now, what about Citizens Charter? A Citizens Charter is a set of commitments made by an organization regarding the standards of service which it delivers. It covers not only the central government ministries, departments, organizations, but also the departments, agencies of state governments, and UD administrations. As an instrument, it is propagated to make an organization transparent, accountable, and citizen friendly. Good governance is the technology, Citizens Charter is the tool. Citizens Charter increases participation of common man in efficient working of an organization by making the citizens aware of the aims and goals of the organization. It helps in reducing corruption through transparent provisions and thus ensures accountability. It leads to citizen friendliness and citizen convenience and raises efficiency and effectiveness in public delivery system. It reduces cost, prevents delay and red tapeism, and thus promote good governance. Citizens Charter set standards of service, allowing high expectations from an organization, pushing them to work diligently. It encourages access and promote choice, and thus treat all fairly. Citizens Charter in India. In 1996, the Center organized a conference of chief secretaries of states and union territories on effective and a responsive administration. The conference inter alia recommended that adoption of citizens of citizen status for all public service organizations. The recommendation was approved by the center, states, and union territories in the Conference of Chief Minister held in 1997. Since 1997, when the scheme was introduced in India, the various ministries, departments, and directorates and other agencies of the central government, state governments, and union territory administrations have formulated a number of citizens charters. Shortcoming of citizens charter in India has become one of the routine activities of the organization had no focus. In many cases, the concerned staff are not adequately trained and sensitized. Sometimes transfers and reshuffles of concerned officers at the crucial stages of formulation, implementation of a citizens charter in an organization severely undermined the strategic processes which were put in place and hampered the progress of the initiative. Lack of awareness and knowledge and inadequate publicity led to loss of trust among service work seekers. Lack of infrastructure and initiative defeated the very purpose of Citizens Charter. Different mindsets of officers and staff, insensitiveness on the part of the supervisors and the staff because they are not yet to be sensitized. Staff is not prepared to shoulder the responsibility due to the lack of motivation and accountability. Non-revision, complicated and restrictive rules and procedures reduced its effectiveness. Reforming Citizens Charter to make them effective. One size does not fit all. Formulation of Citizens Charter should be a decentralized activity with the head office providing only broad guidelines. Wide consultation process. CC be formulated after extensive consultation with the organization, followed by a meaningful dialogue with civil society. Firm commitments to be made. CC must be precise and make firm commitments of service delivery standards to the citizens, consumers in quantifiable terms whenever possible. Redressal mechanism in case of default. Clearly, they lay down the relief which the organization is bound to provide if it has defaulted on the promised standards of delivery. Periodic evaluation of CC, preferably through an external agency. Hold offers officers accountable for results. Fix specific responsibility in cases where there is a default in adhering to the CC. Include civil society in the process to assist an improvement in the contents of the charter, its adherence, as well as educating the citizens about the importance of this vital mechanism. The Second Administrative Reforms Commission, in its 12th report entitled um, Citizen Centric Administration Heart of Governance, has recommended for making the Citizens Charter more effective as a document for interacting with citizens. This recommendation has been accepted by the Government of India. All central ministries, departments have been requested to review their citizens' charters to make them more effective as a tool for interacting with the citizens. It must be implemented in the true spirit.